Hello, Graham. I'm Elizabeth Oriel, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today. Um, so just to introduce myself, I have a background in conservation biology. I've studied other animals' well-being and welfare, and have been interested in the concept of well-being from the sense that I think in our culture, we don't have a really coherent view of human well-being. And so I was sort of interested in thinking about how we view other animals' sense of well-being. So that was previous work. I've also worked on other animals' personhood. And most recently, I'm studying human-animal relations. I'm finishing some research based at the University of London on human-elephant relations and conflict in Sri Lanka. And I look at this from a cohabitation lens, which I think really connects with your work, Graham. I think cohabitation is a lens that looks across beings as persons and is kind of different than the frame of coexistence. And so yeah, I've looked at patterns of relationality across beings in Sri Lanka. And then my next research project is looking at time and how rhythms, how cosmo-ecological rhythms play a role in human-animal relationships, and how rhythm can be viewed as an ethical framework, which also connects very much with your work, because animism seems very much about ethics. So yeah, please introduce yourself.
Right, thanks, Lizzie. That's all great. Lots of things we could talk about. I'm Graham Harvey. I'm Professor of Religious Studies at the Open University, and I've done research among a lot of different religious communities and about lots of different issues. So communities being Jews, pagans, indigenous people in different parts of the world, the issues being around ritual performance, festivals, but most particularly about human relations with the larger than human world. And I guess my name is most commonly associated with animism, the new animism. So we could talk a bit more about that, because as you said, it has interesting connections, I think, with your work. So I've been privileged to spend time with some Native American and First Nation Canadian communities in Newfoundland, in Wisconsin, and whose language, I mean, those particular communities, their language is marked by animist understandings. So there's no, for example, in Anishinaabe language, there's no masculine, feminine pronouns. So, but there's an animate, inanimate pronoun and or gender endings. So not masculine, feminine gender, but animate, inanimate, and it's broader than humans, the animate beings in the world. So rocks are marked as grammatically animate. So the question for all of us is kind of, what does that mean? Does it have any implications for behaviors, ethical and relational, ritual, conversational, all kinds of things? How do you engage with beings who are grammatically animate? Is it just a funny way of speaking, or does it mean anything more than that? So yeah, I think a lot of exciting stuff, and other people engaging with this new animism. I've also been interested, as you know, in elephant-human relations, but I've been quite excited by your work, which broadens that out to human, elephant, and plant relations.
Yes.
So perhaps we can delve a bit more into that. With the word you used just now was cohabitation. So I maybe you can talk a bit more about that.
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, I want to say that I've had a lot of, misgivings about being a UK-based researcher going into a global South country and looking at these things, trying to solve a problem. It feels very colonial as a kind of language, as a kind of knowledge structure. So I've tried to think about my research as I'm learning from, not I'm learning about. And so I've been sort of, because I do think actually that like the farmers that I spent time with, and the elephants and the plants have like immense amounts to teach about how humans can actually be in a different kind of relationship. And so, and there's just sort of massive changes that have gone on over the last 50 years. And in terms of cultivation, in terms of how farmers relate to plants, and how plant communities have changed. So in the past, there was, a kind of shifting cultivation where there was different species were planted together, plants had roles. Um, Sri Lanka also has an amazing history of home gardens, so agroforestry, which again is like huge with plant roles, um, and is key to food security in parts of the island. So that has really changed into, sort of starting with colonialism, and now with lots of plantations and lots of monocrops. And I started to see how the connections between humans and plants are the foundation for all kinds of other relationships, human-animal relationships. And so, yeah, plants play a central role. I mean, one example is the forest cover in elephants in Sri Lanka are called forest species, but they actually really like grass. They like eating grass. And so they really like forests that have, gaps and areas of edge. And so forest cover, naturally occurring forests have really diminished. And, like people talk about elephants as being like homeless migrants, actually. So they kind of move from forest fragment to forest fragment, and they stay in the fragments during the day, and then they come out at night and eat the crops. And, when there's more forest cover, elephants and humans end up having more autonomy, because, they're no longer migrants. They actually can, play out their life way, and do it in a way that's, when I say autonomy, I don't mean necessarily freedom. I think of autonomy in like Escobar's notion of like confident engagement. So they're able to, engage in their world, in their life world. So that's another way that forests and plants sort of shape all kinds of other relationships, including internally.
Yeah.
So yeah, like yeah, I'm curious if you have any feedback on that, or
Yeah. Thanks. No, that's all very exciting. And I share your um, struggle with us going into places where the people, human and other, already know stuff. So we go in as researchers, and some of our um, academic ancestors, at least, often went to places as the big expert,
yeah,
and kind of impose themselves. And what they actually did was take local knowledge and build careers around disseminating it. So that the struggle to be an academic in a more relational, ethical, decent way, we can position ourselves as learners, and I've often used the word guest, which I've learned from Maori hosts and colleagues who have a protocol for making guests. So trying to say I would like to be a guest, but I can't make myself a guest. I can only wait to be invited in or whatever, and then negotiate what our relationship's going to be. So that's kind of complex enough in interhuman relations, especially again, as you said, within a continuing colonial era. Some of my Native American friends talk about, never mind post-colonialism, we're still living with most colonialism, still marginalized, impoverished, and so on. And as Kyle White says, we've lived through climate change already, being shipped from March from wetlands and so on to the arid lands of Oklahoma, knew none of the plants or the animals. So if you want to learn about how to be resilient facing climate change, we already have some skills and knowledge because we've survived and so on. So there's a lot of complexity about our relations as researchers, wanting to learn from people who already know, and what we do with that. But
Yeah.
and then but then the actual stuff that we've been learning among those others, humans, elephants, plants, rocks, and so on, is both wonderful and dangerously easy to romanticize, but on a really good day, an absolute challenge to life as normal in the dominant European European dominated world. So thinking through what as a shorthand animism might be in this kind of relational world, thinking about how all beings are necessarily inherently relations, kin. Darwin made that very clear, let alone anybody else. And yet we've continued to try to be these individualized, separated beings, which has done so much damage to the world and disrupted all these relations.
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah, how do you I mean, I think with all the work you've done on animism and helping people kind of understand it better and think about it, I just wonder like how you relate to this current moment, and also how, how can you as an academic bring this relationality more? Like I feel that there's this total split between sort of the academic world of separation, nature culture separation, and then this way that I'm actually, deeply communicating with the natural world. And so I wonder how you navigate that.
Yeah, well, my sense is pretty much like you. It's a struggle because our disciplinary boundaries keep reinforcing that nature culture thing, absolutely, but also all these other bits of, you can be a philosopher or a scholar of religion or a physicist or something else, and you're not supposed to, you can't claim any expertise beyond those boundaries, which is crazy because we all have some influence and understanding beyond them, and we learn across those boundaries, and the world doesn't work with those boundaries at all. So one of the things that's obsessed me, I think that's the right word, over the last year, is trying to insist that we should drop the word nature. I mean, I'm not alone in this, but the word nature to me keeps reinforcing those boundaries, and those of us who are trying to find ways to engage with new ways of being in the world or old ways of being in the world, when we try and communicate these things, the word nature just brings us back into that nature culture thing, and I've got tired of trying to explain it and say, well, I don't mean that. Nature is another community or series of communities. And I think there are lots of other words that do that same job of reinforcing the dualities of modernity, and I fear that Gaia is one of those things. That Gaia had a moment of being a word that well, for many people did inspire rethinking human relations, human being in the larger than human community. But then it becomes here's this image of the small blue planet, as if we could see it from outside, as if we could manage the whole thing,
Yeah.
as others have said. And it just, you're not in the world, you're not engaging with the trees or the elephants, the plants, the whatever. You're somehow a separated being, and you've accidentally reinforced the human exceptionalism, um, which has all kinds of ramifications around how we do research. So yeah, it's a struggle, and I think, you're taking it further by insisting on the plant relations, because it's kind of easier to do relations with other animals, but insisting that the plants are in some sense persons is quite exciting. So I mean, maybe you want to say a bit more about how that works in your work. You talked about personhood and
Yeah. Well, I'm working on an independent project that's just about my own sort of, like I was talking about this divide in academia, and I have my own personal connection to plants that I can't sort of, it's just kind of there. And so I'm writing about it. And yeah, I've come to see that, in response to what you're saying, I think that how we view the world is often shaped by what we do, like our practices, what we do. And so that's a conundrum in academia, like, because we're not what kind of practice, we're not sort of engaged with physical practices so much. I mean, I know you are, but it ends up being a conundrum. Yeah, in terms of plant personhood, I uh, yeah, I'm just very interested in how plants shape, what is the agency, or what is how are plants really actors in our world? Because I feel like they're foundational. Everything is, they're just, obviously they're foundational to human life in every way. There are oxygen, there are clothes, there are houses, there are everything, there are food. And yet we just don't relate to them that way. We've got plant blindness in the West, and people don't even see plants. And that was one thing in Sri Lanka that was so impressive, is that like everyone knows, everyone you ask, anyone in any kind of job, they will know. If you just point to plants, they'll know what the plant is, they'll know what the plant does medicinally. It's a very plant knowledge culture. And yeah, I I'm just exploring it. And I think, Michael Pollan says plants domesticated us, not or there's a multi-directional quality there. And I
and there's
think,
that thing about there's that thing about grassland spreading around the world, and humans have been a tool for that. We've
yes,
made more grasslands, wheat fields, and so on. So there's that's quite exciting. We think it's, I mean, obviously it has benefits to us, but um, so somebody was talking about this kind of treaty relationship between humans and grasslands. So we got rid of some of the trees and forest in order for the grass to get its way. And now we've signed a different treaty, which is more detrimental to everybody, which is with petrochemicals and so on. That
mhm,
we need to change that one. So,
absolutely,
so
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, and basically, like, I think it's kind of all about these social ecological relations on the very local level, and what you see in a lot of conservation policy, where you've got a protected area where humans are excluded, local humans, indigenous traditional people are excluded, is you end up kind of, with a disaster, really, where plant communities get destroyed, often through illegal grazing or something. And so, in the past, where we didn't have these exclusive separated zones, and humans maintained close relationships with the plants, with each other, that that was successful, and it continues to be among Indigenous people who maintain biodiversity,
Yeah.
you know,
Yes.
across the world. I think 80% of biodiversity is maintained through Indigenous practice. So there's a
Yes.
lot to learn from those close relationships on the ground.
Absolutely, and it is that specificity. So one of the things, because this whole debate about animism and related feels like the kind of ontological turn and the new materialism and so on, that we're kind of introducing big themes, big issues, and sometimes the specificities get lost. So it's
Yeah.
been good. Nourit Berdouid, who's been central to this, keeps reminding us that that this is about specific relations and immediacy. So that whole relation between Indigenous communities and biodiversity isn't the same as the kind of conservation movement, which wants to conserve um, whole blocks, but it's about knowing those particular plants and knowing the relations, which are about consumption and benefit, but to both sides. So the communities that lived in a place for a long time, thousands of years in many places, um, maintaining diversity because of some respectful relation that also involves, that necessarily involves not using. So these plants or these animals have the right, in that understanding, to live their own way, and there has to be therefore a limit to what humans will do. And then you see the immediate difference when European colonization hits places, a massive decline in
Exactly.
diversity of human life as well as of plant, animal, insect, and every other kind of life. Um, so it's it's not hidden, um, and therefore there is this implication. So so you asked a little while ago about the or you started talking about your relations with plants that aren't just academic interest in other humans' interest in plants. So likewise, my learning among those indigenous communities has led me to think, well, I have to take this seriously and think, how do I adjust my life without all those appropriations and um, elite kind of colonial engagements, thinking about, well, if I take seriously how those people are, are talking about the world, well, what does it mean for my being in this particular place, my moving through this landscape? Um, and so one of the things, and perhaps it helps that I'm a scholar of religion, I pay a lot of attention to rituals or ceremonial etiquette, and it comes to me that what this is all about is etiquette of relationship, and we have ways of greeting other humans that are specific in local communities. So the thing that's intrigued me is, how do I, and I mean me rather than we generally, how do I find a good way to introduce myself to the plants and animals, the birds um, that I live among, um, and gain some sort of attention that says, I want to be a respectful human. I want to be part of this bigger community, but we've lost the basic etiquette for doing that. So we kind of, and that again reinforces that we think nature is out there separate, because we don't try and communicate in that way. We don't sit by the tree for a long time. We accuse people of being tree huggers, but you know, but you don't just go up and hug any human. So tree hugging maybe also isn't that respectful. How so I want to kind of find ways of being quiet and listening and learning what it is that those other beings might want. Some of it's obvious, like at the moment, I keep being distracted by the house sparrows who assume that this place is built for them to build their nests up in the eaves. They don't necessarily recognise this is a house. They recognise some of the dangers. There's a cat around, but those kind of immediate relations that we're all involved in. Whether we think of ourselves as researchers, academics, or whatever, we're also people who live in place, and we ought, if we're going to learn from other people, we're going to do research among other communities, then we should be respectful enough to think maybe there are implications for adjusting our lives, for thinking about leaving space for the other beings around us. So those are kind of some of the thoughts of
Yeah, I love that.
how do we adjust.
Absolutely. That's essential, like taking on those ethics in our lives. And I think about that too, like how do I introduce myself? And I found that like like acknowledging this other being usually works quite well for me. So if there's a particular ash tree that I'm like feel drawn to, a connection to, I'll just acknowledge the tree in some way, like the beauty of it, or I
Yeah,
find that sort of opens up this kind of feeling of connection and relationship. So
yes.
I
And
really,
I think that's particularly important because we are talking about some of those beings we want to eat and we don't want to be eaten by. So
yes,
then it isn't just a romantic, here's a lovely tree that I want to engage with. It's also about the plants who give us life in a very obvious way, and not just give us the oxygen, but also give us nutrition and so on. So my favorite definition of religion is that of a Maori scholar, Pakatawhai Te Pakatawhai, who some years ago, he's died since he wrote this. He said, the purpose of religious activity among my people is doing violence with impunity. So we're kind of, everyone's told don't kill, but you also have to feed your guests, as he explains. So you have to eat as well. So the purpose of religious activity isn't about praising transcendent beings or trying to gain some better afterlife or improved next life or something. It's about these very immediate, I have to do acts of violence against those around me, plants, animals, insects, whatever, and negotiating that. So you do rituals, you introduce yourself, as you said, and indigenous communities in particular have these longer traditions of doing those things. That's the etiquette of relationship. So I try to find ways in which I do that in my garden in a small way, and then in a bigger way, these kind of annual rituals that people are beginning to evolve, in which we say please and thank you to the beings who become our food, and also contemplate the possibility of our bodies being nutritious to others at some point. Well, they are already nutritious to others. The bacteria in our guts and so on are using us to gain their nutrition. So all these kind of interesting ways of thinking about multi-species relations.
absolutely. Yeah, I've been thinking about the kind of intangible aspects of people who deal with human wildlife conflict, as it's framed, or human elephant conflict. And there's so many, it's sort of, it's interesting to sort of foreground the ways that the less tangible aspects of living, because farmers are really, it's like a political negotiation. They're sharing land, and there's daily acts of negotiation of how, how do I farm this land, but also, deal with these large herbivores that are coming and eating my crops. And a lot of it has to do, I mean, it's interesting how much farmers talk about their emotional states. So it's like emotion becomes this sort of centerpiece, and what they're feeling, what elephants are feeling, how that gets transmitted back and forth. And then also so much about perception, about light, lack of light, sound, lack of sound. And then all these sort of intermediaries like flies and mud. And so, yeah, it's really, I kind of like thinking about that because it sort of very much relates to etiquette and sort of what kind of internal emotional state works best and what doesn't. And,
Yeah.
and these farmers know that stuff really well. And
Yeah, and it forces us as academics. I've been to so many conferences where we talk about whether it's performance conferences or environmental conferences, where we all sit in rows and we listen for hours and hours to people talking, and that the whole Cartesian privileging of mind as if it was a separate thing, and you go, come on, this is a conference of people who do dance or farm or whatever, and you go, you're totally abusing your body and everybody else's body. So this whole learning about the sensuality of our engagement. So our research also has to be a sensual, embodied, not just embodied, but bodily relation that involves that kind of movement and being aware of the sounds and smells and all those things. Oh, it's great. There's lots of exciting things happening, and it's great. This community of um, environmental philosophers, or whatever we're meant to be, the bringing people together who are all on this path, thinking about how we do research, how we act differently in this relational world. All very exciting.
yeah,
So,
absolutely.
yeah.